Welcome to this very special seminar that we're organizing called Kidnapping Venezuela Sovereignty, which is an urgent conversation, of course, given everything that's happened in the last week, a conversation on hyper-imperialism, military intervention, and hybrid warfare against Venezuela. And just to introduce myself, my name is Tings Chak. I'm the Asia co-coordinator of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which is hosting this event today. And of course, Tricontinental is part of the International People's Assembly, which is a political platform that unites hundreds of mass movements and people's organizations worldwide. And today's webinar is part of the IPA's International Day of Action today, in solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution, to condemn imperialism and to demand the immediate liberation of President Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. So, exactly 1 week ago, on January 3rd, the United States launched the Operation Absolute Resolve, which was a massive assault on Venezuela, including 150 aircraft that bombed Caracas, La Guaira, Miranda State. The Delta Force troops kidnapped President Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores, who, in addition to being the First Lady, is a former Attorney General and the National Assembly President and longtime Bolivarian revolutionary. And far from bloodless, at least 80 combatants were killed, including 32 Cuban internationalists, as well as other civilians. And so how do we assess this moment of history? 2 years ago, the Tricontinental launched a study naming this era as the era of hyper-imperialism. And in many ways, January 3rd is a confirmation of this reality that we're living. And despite the talk of multipolarity, we have seen from Ukraine to Gaza, now to Venezuela, that the truth is quite stark. U.S. military supremacy is being increasingly used to compensate for its relative loss of economic, productive, and even moral standing in the world. And still 10 days from completing his first year back in office, Trump has already bombed 8 countries: Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Palestine, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and now Venezuela. And Trump proposes to increase its military spending by 50% to $1.5 trillion, shattering any illusions about him or the MAGA movement or what else as being any less warmongering. So hyper-imperialism, this dangerous, decadent phase of imperialism, combines military supremacy that is being unleashed before our eyes, economic warfare through sanctions, asset seizures, tariff wars, psychological operation, and a total disregard for international law. And this Monroe Doctrine or Donroe Doctrine with stealth aircraft or return to gunboat diplomacy, but now with trillion-dollar budgets. But it's important to note that despite this barbarism, the U.S. has not imposed the regime change in Venezuela. The psychological operations alleging that now acting President Delcy Rodriguez had been co-opted really fails to understand our own revolutionary background and formation. Within hours, she convened the interior and defense ministers and the high military command with the message that the civic military unity is intact, that Chavismo still controls the state, and Maduro remains and must return as a legitimate president. And the Venezuelans have mobilized in the masses through its thousands of communes, its 8 million people and militias, and 25 years of organizing for the Bolivarian Revolution. So to make this introduction, to kind of pause this introduction, I want to introduce our guests in the webinar today. We've brought 3 amazing speakers who will speak about 15 minutes each, and then we'll open up for discussions. And I wanted to just say that for those in the webinar, please use the chat to leave comments and your questions. Keep your microphone muted, but if you can, please turn on your cameras. It's always very lovely to see your faces and engage with you that way. And for those of you joining on YouTube and Facebook, welcome. And we'll also be monitoring the chat there. So I'll introduce each speaker before they speak, and I'll introduce our first speaker, which is Carlos Ron, the former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for North America in Venezuela, and today is one of the coordinators of Tricontinental Nuestra America. And Carlos will bring some insight from the front lines joining us from Caracas. So Carlos, take it away.
Well, thank you. Thanks. And I'm Very happy to see many of you. I have to say, first of all, that I know I've seen, some of the faces that I see here have sent me messages during this past week. Some of them I haven't even been able to reply because everything's been so overwhelming, but I appreciate your solidarity and your concern always for us, and just the fact that, we're here, we're standing, we're in peace in Caracas is a sign of victory, of resilience, of resistance, and of this collective construction that has been the Bolivarian Revolution. I want to focus on a couple things that I've been, meditating on, the craziness of this week. That I think it's important to share with you, to give you perhaps a better context and a better feel of what we are undergoing. I mean, I'm in the middle of Caracas. Uh, the attacks occurred, um, uh, at about a 10-kilometer distance from where I'm at right now. I do have a hill that sort of buffers between me and where the main attacks took place. So, and on that morning, our windows were rattling here. We saw lights, but we couldn't really see exactly what, the destruction. But it was very, of course, it was very close to us and very startling. For a country that has not seen an international conflict since its War of Independence, and maybe, a blockade in 1902, and one ship that was attacked during the World War II by the Nazis. Other than that, this overwhelming force of military force and strikes and bombs is something that was very foreign to all Venezuelans, and even all Latin Americans, because we've had violence in our history, but U.S. bringing this level of violence and not being something internal like a coup or like a something with local amount of violence, it is something new for us. So I want to say first something, that I think is important, that we continue to restate over and over again. A serious act of war was committed against Venezuela. This is in violation of the Charter of the United Nations, violation of Article 2, Article 1, Article 51. We could probably, find at least half of the charter and find some violation in that. It's a violation of the Rome Statute as well, because these areas that were affected were areas where civilian population lives. It was not just military targets. It was not just, the place where the abduction took place. I mean, we're talking about four states, like things mentioned at the beginning, infrastructure that was hit, something that is not coming out in the news, but our deposits of um, medicines for patients that have kidney problems, and they were that was also destroyed. It left us with a 2 day supply, basically, for this population, and so, Brazil has taken the initiative of supplying, giving us, sending us the medicines to take care of that deficit. That's something that acting President Delcy spoke to President Lula, and took place. But I want you to get the understanding that civilian populations was affected. We have a record of at least 100 people died between civilians and military resisting the incursion, and there are many other wounded, probably somewhere around 100 as well. Um, this is important because it's, again, a violation of international law. It is an act of war. It's a violation of U.S. internal law, which requires congressional approval before striking, the military strike. And we have to say, the president of a sovereign nation was abducted with his wife, who's a member of the National Assembly, in disregard of their immunity, and they have been taken to New York to face trumped up charges in a court. They are prisoners of war, and as such, as should be treated. And I think that is one of the most important things that international solidarity must keep in mind. They are prisoners of war. They are not, this is not a law enforcement operation. This isn't a drug operation. In the first couple of hours, they redid the whole indictment and took out took out many of the mentions of the so-called cartel of the Suns, which was part of the accusation against President Maduro, because these are things that don't stand. I mean, they even know that they won't be able to stand in the courts, so they started taking this out and changing wording. So it shows that this is really a regime change type of operation and has nothing to do with any other consideration. But we are demanding that both President Maduro and Celia Flores are returned to Venezuela. And that's a demand out of all the revolutionary forces in Venezuela, all the popular forces in Venezuela, and is the demand of the government of Venezuela. And also, it's important for you to know that Venezuela continues to be under military threat, despite the fact that Trump announced that a second strike wasn't going to be necessary. There's something that is still there's still massive military buildup out there. They picked up some of them, but they're still out there. They're still striking boats that they consider may have these extrajudicial and illegal strikes that boats that they think are drug boats. There's still never a naval blockade or an oil quarantine, as Marco Rubio has expressed. This is in place. And President Trump, in his first press conference right after the events, said that if he believes that it is necessary to use force again, he will. So this is not over in that sense. There's still this looming threat on Venezuela. The second thing I want to discuss, though, and I think it's important for us to think about this. Maybe counterintuitive, but I think there's a story that has to be told. The Bolivarian Revolution was not defeated. The Bolivarian Revolution was not overthrown. The Bolivarian Revolution has shown the world its capability of withstanding such an attack and that it has such a moral and political strength that it has kept the revolutionary leadership intact, that it has kept the military leadership united, that has kept popular leadership in the streets mobilized. I mean, I've been going to, a few hours each day. We've been going to marches in the center of Caracas, but all over all the cities in the country are doing this. I mean, there are people mobilized. One day it was a women's march. One day was a communes. Yesterday was social movements. The youth mobilized. Every sector of society here has been mobilizing. There's effective control over the state. There's effective control over the national oil company. There's effective social peace, which is necessary to guarantee the livelihood of Venezuelans. We keep going despite being under siege. To me, such is the strength of the revolutionary movement that even the opposition that was anointed by the empire, their agents, those that mediated the strikes, those that asked for intervention, they weren't able to gather, amass, or even buy enough support to overthrow the government. And that is the reason today that there's not a civil war, or that is the reason today that we're not rounded up in a stadium waiting to be killed like we've seen in other processes in the past. Now, I think this is important for our movements and for our people to understand in this context of hyperimperialism. And I think there's a word here to be said, especially for the progressives or the progressive movement, and even for the ultra left. And I want to stress this because, see, for many, the positions that Venezuela took, especially in the progressive movement, we were often accused of being radical. And there's going to be a narrative that's going to be built and say, you brought this upon yourselves because you were radical, because you didn't, because you didn't try to fit in, or you didn't try to negotiate. And my honest belief right now is that if we're still standing here, I mean, if the fact that, I can speak to you freely right now, and there are not bombs falling over our heads right now, it's because we were that radical, not because we weren't, not because we wanted to act and mediate, with the right wing, I think that has some worth. And at the same time, I think that the ultra left has to understand that we are under siege, and what we're going to face now needs a lot of fine tuning, a lot of clear thinking, and a lot of less romanticism or idealism about what the circumstances. We have to have a very realist approach at what our capabilities are and what we're uh, and what we're facing. I think the priority for Venezuelans revolutionaries now is first to keep peace. We we can't have a country, we can't have a revolution if we're destroyed by war. We need to keep peace. We need to keep unity. If we fall into divisionism, if we fall into questions, and if we fall into all these um, uh, you know uh, points that would bring us apart, we're not going to be able to withstand the pressures. And we need to maintain our ground that this was an illegal act of war, and that our president and then first lady have been abducted, and they must return to Venezuela. And we know this is not an easy task, but I mean, there are laws, there are international laws, there's structures there that could make this happen. And I think this pressure must be mounted. The hyperimperialism has to know that it cannot just take these actions without being contested. And we must not be afraid to contest empire. Now, a quick word on loyalty and treason and the acting president, because I know that even on the left there has been a lot of rumors. Of course, I mean we're flooded by the Western narrative. We're flooded by media corporations that want to, of course, show a divide, a treason, and but let me tell you, I mean, if everybody that was here, there's such clarity in Venezuela that this didn't take place. First, because you see everyone united. You see the family. I mean, the son of President Maduro, his stepbrothers, and I mean the whole family, the whole military, revolutionary groups, leadership, all the popular leaders. Everybody's together. Everybody understands what went on. And in a way, history has a funny way of of bringing us to this point. But we have to trust in the vision that President Maduro had, and which is the vision that President Chavez had. I mean, we all knew since the onset that defying the empire was going to bring something, huge amounts of threats and pressure against us. So when President Chavez thought about President Maduro, when he knew his life was at risk, he thought about that he was capable of continuing the project. When the threats, these huge threats started, amassing against Venezuela, President Maduro knew what he was doing as well, and he knew this scenario was possible, and he knew who to entrust for this scenario to take place. Acting President Delcy Rodriguez comes from a long revolutionary family. I don't think anybody has, I mean, if anybody has undergone or has seen violence in her life, that has seen the violence of the right wing, is her when she lost her father, who was a revolutionary from Venezuela, and her whole life was affected by that, and her whole family was affected by that. And that's why I believe she's probably the best prepared person to deal with the aftermath of a brutal attack like the one we have undergone, to have the clarity, the moral integrity to continue and to lead us on. So I think it is very important for that, for revolutionaries around the world to understand why acting President Delcy Rodriguez has the support of the revolutionary forces, and why this idea of treason is just part of the narrative of the West to break us up. On the a word on the issue of fighting back or defending ourselves. I think there was enormous courage on the part of the Venezuelans that faced this, especially the Venezuelans in the military, especially the Cuban internationalists that were here. They sacrificed their lives. But the attack was a brutal military attack. It is a country that spends over $1 trillion in its military budget. I mean, the overwhelming force of, or military force of the US, the overwhelming technology. I mean, they tried new weapons out here that we, so the magnitude, and it's obvious that they have more power, and we don't have to romanticize. I mean, we have to understand where we are and what our abilities are and capabilities. But we must never doubt that there was courage on the part of the Venezuelans, military resisting, and that everybody put out with the strength they had, with the weapons they had, with the tools they had, with the courage they had. I mean, their stories and the testimonies are really deep. I've seen many of the survivors of the attack express how they felt at the moment, express what they did, the courage that they had, how it was really difficult for U.S. forces to come in, even in their press conferences. They said, it was we barely made it out. We barely made it successful. They were proud of having done this, but they've recognized that they didn't have. It wasn't easy. It was a very difficult operation. So I think it's important for us to recognize that, and for the revolutionary forces around the world to understand that Venezuela put up the fight that it was able to put. And finally, again, just reassurance on, because we've been talking in Tricontinental about the future, and I think we must prepare for the future under hyperimperialism with a deep sense of reality, a deep sense of what we're capable of, a deep understanding of what popular organization and popular education and coming together mean. Again, the reason we're here is because we were radical enough to understand what we were facing. I think preparing in the spirit of the sacrifices and the victories of Palestine, of Vietnam, was what have given us the courage to face what we're facing now. And let us not underestimate the power of revolution. It's going to be difficult. I mean, we're going to be facing this massive empire with a brutal military force, with a brutal greed, for many years to come. We must be serene about this. We must have nerves of steel, like President Maduro says. We must be ready to understand the limits of our actions and be smart about how we conduct them. I think that is the lesson that we must learn from Venezuela. And I think right now, international solidarity is key for the revolutionary process to be able to continue, to withstand, and like always, to succeed and to overcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. And thank you for your incredibly tireless work. It's been very important to get this analysis and perspective from the ground, to hear the mobilization of the Venezuela people and the resilience of the Bolivarian Revolution, but also to help us sift through a lot of the confusion that is being sowed. And that's not even just from, the Western mainstream media. It's also being sowed amongst left and progressive forces, which actually hamper rather than increase our capacities to do this international solidarity that we really need for now and for tomorrow. So now I'm going to turn to our second speaker, who is Stephanie Weatherbee. She is the coordinator of the Operative International Secretariat of the International People's Assembly, which has been very active in mobilizing exactly that, the anti-imperialist and solidarity efforts across all the continents. So Stephanie, over to you, please.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon and good evening. I'm very happy to be here with you all. I'm Stephanie, and I'm part of the Secretariat of the International People's Assembly. And as most people here know, the IPA is an international process of more than 200 social movements, trade unions, and political parties that since its foundation has identified that US imperialism is the central contradiction of our times. It's the main obstacle that we are facing to building projects that develop real equality, that develop real transformation and development within our countries. And over the past few days, the IPA has been quick to make a call for mass mobilizations across the world. And I'm very happy to report that we've been able to document more than 200 cities mobilizing across the world in the 5 days that ensued after the completely illegal intervention into Venezuela and the kidnapping of President Maduro and first combatant Celia Flores. So I think that I want to start by addressing this question that many people have been discussing of how did this happen? Why did this happen, right? And I think the first thing to say is that US imperialism is a familiar actor. We have plenty of experience in every single one of our countries with the behavior, the intentions, the agenda, and the willingness of US imperialism to act with violence. And so while many of us experience shock, myself included, because of what Carlos said, which is that we are in a region where this kind of violence is unprecedented, no one should be surprised that the US was both able and willing to carry out an operation of this nature. So I think it's important to point out that the specific assertion that has been made by the analysis of hyperimperialism that the Tricontinental Institute developed over the past 3 years is about precisely this desperate, increasingly bellicose nature of the US ruling class and of the combined institutions that command foreign policy. The United States is very, very aware that it is losing its grip over the hegemony that it built in the post-war period. It is very aware that this hegemony rests on its industrial base, its economic capacity, its technological head over many other countries, and that it has lost this to China and to other Asian countries. So increasingly, the United States is resorting to using violence to abandon other channels to be able to carry out its agenda. And this hyper-imperialism is not just about becoming more violent, because we know that the US has been violent. The US's approach to asserting its rule has been violent forever, right? We can never forget that the United States is the only country in the world that has launched an atomic bomb. So this kind of violence should not be something that we didn't see or foresee. But what is clear is that the United States is abandoning any illusion of trying to build its hegemony on the basis of some kind of ideological narrative of spreading democracy or promoting security or protecting us from terrorism, protecting us from all the supposed ills that the US has identified over many years to justify their action. Increasingly, what we're seeing is naked self-interest. The US, the White House, and that the very bellicose Hegseth Rubio triad expressing very clearly what is at stake for the United States is their own self-interest. And so this is what hyperimperialism has highlighted, that the United States is willing, it's capable, and increasingly desperate. And it is no longer needing other partners around the world. It doesn't need to have a diplomatic justification for doing the things that it does. It doesn't need to explain itself. It doesn't need to coerce and convince other actors that what it's doing is justified. It is acting with naked and brute force. And so what unfolded immediately following the operation was a massive misinformation campaign that attributed the kidnapping to a combination of complicity and treason by sections of the Bolivarian Revolution. And I think it's very important for us to remember that we know US imperialism. We don't need to behave like forensic analysts and look at what evidence exists for or against this telling of the incident. We don't need to say, well, how many people died and how many planes were mobilized. We know US imperialism. We know what it is capable of doing. We know what it is willing to do. And the fact that we are questioning its ability and its willingness to carry out such a reckless and criminal act without any cooperation from internal actors shows our own naivety and shows our own ignoring the facts and the history that we know. And so I think that a lot of actors have unwittingly become instruments of this narrative that seeks to divide the left and seeks to divide especially the Venezuelan left. It seeks to instill within the Venezuelan left a level of distrust for the government that has taken power, to weaken this government's power as it goes into negotiations with the United States. Now, I want to move on to talk about the campaign against the Latin American left that the United States has mobilized historically, that is not related specifically to Venezuela, but is related in general to the whole of the Latin American left. The campaign against the Latin American left began with a US failure to court and co-opt the Bolivarian Revolution. So initially, when Chavismo comes into power, the United States tries, as always, to try to approach whatever sections it can within this new government to try to convince them to abandon the revolutionary route, to try to bribe them, to separate them from the leadership and the organizations that have been built. When this failed, the second focus of the US campaign against Venezuela was to attack the viability of the project, to make the project of the Bolivarian Revolution unviable by attacking its economic base, to make it incapable of being able to carry out the kind of political, the kind of economic reforms, especially that it was pursuing. We have to remember that the first line of action of the Bolivarian Revolution was to attack inequality. This is a country that had for its entire history been composed of a very small elite that profited from the oil revenue of the country's reserves. Meanwhile, the mass of the population was living in dire poverty and experiencing literal hunger. And so the first line of action of the revolution was attacking this inequality by providing any kinds of programs that would provide housing to the population, that would provide food, that would make access to health to the whole of the population, to expand the opportunity of education. And so the second focus for the US was to attack the economic base of the Bolivarian Revolution so that these projects couldn't advance. And they were unable to do this in its entirety. And so a third approach, which was equally important, has been to isolate Venezuela within Latin America in general. And so this fulfills two very important objectives. One is to contain the revolution. We know this from the history of the United States' actions in Asia and the need to contain Vietnam, to contain China, that when a revolution succeeds and when the United States is unable to defeat it internally, it needs to then follow up by containing it, to make sure that it doesn't spread, to make sure that it doesn't influence other left projects in the region, right? To effect a so-called domino effect. And so the vilification of the Venezuelan revolution in every country of the region has fulfilled this purpose of attacking the legitimacy of any left party and candidate in every country in our region. Every single election that we have in Latin America, the right's central narrative is to warn us against the evils and the stupidity of Chavismo. Every single left candidate in the region, whether they are in Mexico or in Colombia, whether they're in Panama or Brazil, are accused of falling into this so-called dictatorial cult of Chavismo, right? That it is an anti-democratic ideology, that it is an ideology that spreads inequality, that is based on propagating poverty and benefiting just a small class of political actors at the top. This narrative has been mobilized in every single election in the region, and it helps to make the path of the left to come to power in other countries much more difficult. Of course, this is very easy to do because the media in our continent is very centrally controlled by a few corporations that are all aligned with the United States. We have a very highly concentrated media across every country in the region, and they're all very aligned with the United States and with the US imperialist agenda. And so every single left project in the region has been accused of this line, and it has all helped to weaken the left in our countries and to make the path of revolution much harder. But the second objective of this approach is also to materially and diplomatically weaken Venezuela, to isolate it from the other actors in the region, to make it a pariah state, right? So this campaign that the US has run from the very beginning, since the success of Hugo Chavez in elections, this campaign that has run the gamut of tactics has severely weakened solidarity from the range of political actors that have a role to play in defending regional sovereignty. So what I mean by that is that every single political actor across Latin America should be coming out to defend our sovereignty, should be coming out to condemn an illegal military attack on a country and the kidnapping of a head of state. But because Venezuela has been turned into a pariah, because Venezuela has been so maligned in the public opinion, many actors, whether they be on the right or the left or the center, have been hesitant to call out this action and its violence. And so I have to say, very sadly, that social democratic forces, which should play a role in defending the Venezuelan revolution, even if just for the sake of defending its sovereignty, have by and large contributed to the isolation of Venezuela. They have fallen prey to the US campaign of delegitimization. And so in the past few years, the choice to question the Venezuelan electoral process, to put every program of the revolution under the magnifying glass, of scrutinizing every political reform pursued in the Venezuelan National Assembly is completely unjustified and self-defeating to all projects of the Latin American social democratic and left forces. It does not serve our interests to attack a national project in the way that the Venezuelan project has been attacked. And so many actors that range from being left to being social democratic have fallen prey to this campaign that has weakened overall regional integration, that has weakened our capacity to defend our sovereignty across the region. And so this is what we're facing right now. And of course, moving on to talk about multipolarity. Of course, everybody here wishes that Venezuela and every nation and peoples that are suffering attacks by US imperialism could count on the robust support of the countries that are increasingly playing a role in building a multipolar international order. Of course, we wish that China and Russia and Iran and other actors that are openly opposed to the US imperialism would play a bigger role. But we have to understand that this is not, their inability to act is not a question of willingness. It's a question of the maturity of the building of the multipolar order and the capacity of these actors to actually counter US imperialism right now. And so I think that instead of critiquing their inability and lamenting the fact that they can't take the kind of action that we wish that they would, we need to understand what is the role of popular organizations of this time. We need to understand that political parties, that social movements, that trade unions, and all those that have the capacity to act and take action have a protagonist role in defending sovereignty and denouncing US imperialism. And what I mean by that is that we don't have to wait for governments, for states to take the lead. We have a lot of governments and states that are in solidarity with Venezuela, that have come out with statements that denounce the US aggression, that denounce US imperialism. There have been great statements coming out, not only from countries like China and Russia, but from countries across Africa. Even Malaysia issued a great statement condemning US imperialism. But we have to remember that the role of taking the streets and denouncing US imperialism on the streets, the role of influencing public opinion to condemn this kind of operation is the role of social movements, is the role of political parties. We don't have to wait for governments and for the multipolar order to take the lead. And so I just wanted to close by saying that this is the role that history has delegated us at this time. That if nobody else is willing to come out and defend the Bolivarian Revolution, not for the sake of what it has conquered and what it represents, but for the right that it has to chart its own path and build its own model of development and defend its sovereignty, then nobody is going to do it. We have to take the lead in that regard. We have to come out into the streets. We have to influence our own governments. We cannot be held back by political actors that are weary, that are questioning, that are putting the Venezuelan process under scrutiny. We have to be willing to defend our own sovereignty by coming out and condemning the kinds of attacks that Venezuela has been subject to and that other nations will be subject to if we fail to denounce these. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think was a really important intervention to help us remind us of the centrality of this principal contradiction, which is U.S. imperialism, but also help contextualize these actions against Venezuela as being something, how it plays out across the region in Latin America and the Caribbean, and how it impacts domestically, but as a regional project. And of course, thank you for bringing a bit of hope too in terms of the mobilization that's happening despite the brutality of this moment. And the fact is that, as you said, defending Venezuelan sovereignty is about defending all of our sovereignty, and that's why we have to take to the streets. So I'd like to invite our third and final speaker, who is Vijay Prashad, the Executive Director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And before I pass it on to him, I'd just like to remind everyone who's joining, whether on YouTube or in the webinar, you can use the chat to ask any questions or provide any comments, and we'll try to have a half-hour session at the end for all of our three speakers. So Vijay, please go ahead. Is Vijay on the call still?
Yeah. Vijay, you there?
Yes, I was muted and I was trying to get you to unmute me.
Okay, sorry.
Yes. Actually, Stephanie just provided a master class of political analysis, and that is really the reason why Stephanie is our leader in the International People's Assembly. That was really, really excellent. And before Stephanie, Carlos really gave us a solid grounding in the kind of internal politics of Venezuela, but also the conflictual situation that has been imposed on Venezuela, not only by imperialism, but by what Stephanie was talking about, which is the governments of the region. Not all of them providing the kind of political space for the Bolivarian revolution to survive through this hybrid war and then this horrendous attack on the 3rd of January. So I'm really happy to follow both Carlos and Stephanie. I'm just going to make a few points. In fact, it's very well positioned right after Stephanie, because I want to mainly talk about the contradictions of our moment. And, for us, as people of the left, and I see that we have an entire range of people from around the world, starting, I think, in South Korea and the Republic of Korea at one end. There's Dehan basically almost asleep at one end, and at the other end, I think it's basically Los Angeles, I think. And I think I spotted some people from Los Angeles barely waking up. We have a whole span of the world here. And we are moving on the contradictions, because that's exactly what we do as people who are building the clarity and confidence of the working class and allied classes, is that we move on the contradictions. We don't seek either purity or complete, sort of, I was going to say pollution, but complete violence. There's always contradictions in between, and we move on those contradictions. So I want to lay out some of those contradictions, some which have already provided what we could consider to be victories. But first, a word on the concept hyperimperialism. Yes, 2 years ago, we published a text, January of 2024, on hyperimperialism, the decade and decaying period in which we are. And I don't want that concept to be misunderstood at all, because the concept basically argued that as the United States and the collective West finds that its economic power in the world is beginning to erode, as its economic power is eroding, it is taking advantage of two elements or two resources of power that it has to try to exercise its authority over the world. And we emphasize those two elements, one more than the other. The first element is the military element. I mean, no power in the world is going to spend over $1 trillion, half its wealth, on the military and not come up with some pretty amazing devices. I mean, the fact that they had those EA-18 Growlers sitting in Puerto Rico and flew them over Venezuela, 150 military aircraft in Venezuelan skies, unprecedented attack. The Growlers are designed for complete jamming of communications and complete jamming of radar defense systems. They took out radar defense systems across the country. They cut power, they cut communications. I mean, the extraordinary power of the US military has to be marveled at. I mean, it's the most powerful military that we've seen, but it's only the most powerful military technologically. It can only destroy things. It's not a military that can exercise hegemony. It is not capable of coming onto the ground and taking over Venezuela. It's not capable of invading the soil of Venezuela without facing enormous popular upsurge. And that's the first contradiction. The first contradiction was the United States had to recognize that the Bolivarian Revolution would not so easily collapse with the landing of US troops in La Guaira or wherever they would plan to land. They would face something that is perhaps even more deadly than in Iraq from the Bolivarian project, because the people who have been mobilized into Bolivarianism over the last quarter century are not willing to set the clock back to 1997. They want to advance history, not return to 97, just as the Cuban people know that the end of the Cuban Revolution means a return to 1958. They don't want to do that. They want to live in the present. They don't want to return to the oligarchy and so on. So the first contradiction was, despite the immense technological power of the US military, it cannot actually subdue a population that has understood its own gains and is politicized and mobilized. That's the first contradiction, and I think it's for me a very important contradiction to bear in mind. But the United States has a second resource of power, and that's information warfare. How cleverly the United States built up the narrative of the drug situation, how cleverly they kept going on and on that this is a police action and Nicolas Maduro is a narco terrorist and this and that and the other. Then they started bombing these boats, about 100 boats, 100 people killed, in these boat attacks. I mean, the absolute marvel of information warfare. The media around the world parroting the information coming out of Marco Rubio, perhaps better called Narco Rubio, out of Narco Rubio's mouth, parroting what he was saying around the world. Incredible use of these myths, Tren de Aragua and then Cartel de los Sols and, what not. Incredible media narrative. But you see, the contradictions come to bite them even there. You put Nicolas Maduro Moros, Celia Flores in a court, and the United States has to withdraw the charge, saying, well, there's nothing called the Cartel de los Sols, which is something that we had been writing about through Globetrotter 2 years ago, and then a year ago, and then some months ago, Carlos, we had a piece out saying exactly that this Cartel de los Sols is a made-up thing by Venezuelan journalists in the 1990s. Contradiction. Despite their immense grab of information through control over, YouTube, over satellites, over undersea cables, and so on, it's not possible because we are alive and we continue to jam on with what we consider to be the truth. And that is why our presence on the streets is so important, because we are not permitting them to lie their way to hegemony again. We are not permitting them. That's the second source of the contradiction. Every single protest you went to and every single protest you organized was part of the counter media to their media. Every single protest. No protest is too small to counter the lies that come out of hyper-imperialism as it seeks to exert its power on the world. And every time we go on the street and say, that's a lie, we force them one way or the other to have to acknowledge that. And in this case, they had to acknowledge it because I suppose they understood the 92-year-old judge who is sitting there in the court in which Nicolas Maduro Moro said, I am a prisoner of war. The 92-year-old judge is going to look at the evidence and say, my God, what am I dealing with? I mean, is this truly a courtroom or what is this? I mean, how they treated Muammar Gaddafi, not even a question of having a trial, sodomized and then killed. How they treated Saddam Hussein, that was not even a courtroom. Bring him to a real court. Let's see Saddam tell us who provided the chemical weapons in the 1980s to use against Iran. Tell us about the West Germans. Tell us about Donald Rumsfeld. But they didn't want to hear all that. They killed Osama bin Laden before he could sing in the courtroom. Tell us who came and met him in Sudan. Tell us who met him in Afghanistan. What was the Americans doing with him during the so-called jihad against the Soviets? Tell us all those stories, Manuel Noriega. He was muzzled in the courtroom in Florida. Tell us about the drug dealing you were doing. What about Hernandez from Honduras? Convicted drug offender. Trump wants to let him go. Let him sing and tell us, what were you doing for the United States of America? Yes, every protest we do sets the contradictions in motion. Very important that we continue it. The third contradiction, if the first was that the Bolivarian process itself prevented an armed landing and an easy takeover by the military, just as the Iraqis fought back, just as the Afghans fought back, just as the Libyans never allowed a landing, and yet that country now destroyed. In that sense, the Bolivarian process is not permitted the Marines to land, as it were. The second contradiction is information. Our protests make an enormous difference. We have to continue to fight against the lies that come out of the mouth of the empire. It's not just Trump, my friends. It's not just Trump. Barack Obama signed the executive order in 2015 that sets in motion the legal foundation for what's been happening. It's not just Trump. It's a big mistake. Trump is a continuation of the structure of hyper-imperialism. But the third contradiction, very important contradiction in my opinion, is Trump has taken the Monroe Doctrine further, and he has said, we want to control and take charge of all of the Western Hemisphere. Okay, all right. What about Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao? Take it from the Dutch. Go ahead. Take it from the Dutch. What about Turks and Caicos, the Cayman Islands? Take that from the British. What about French Guiana? Take that from the French. Let's see how those contradictions manifest themselves. But my friends, you think I'm just joking. Trump took his eyes off the north. He was only looking south. While he was looking south, in December, Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, released a fantastic report saying that Canada wants to exercise, and mind you, he used this word, exercise sovereignty over its Arctic Circle. In other words, Canada and Denmark will collaborate. There was no mention of the United States in that. The Canada is going to cut out the United States from free access to the Northwest Passage in the north. There are contradictions. Trump saying we are taking Greenland. Go ahead and take Greenland. You already have it. Why should we defend Danish colonialism? We don't care about that. We want sovereignty for the Greenlanders. We don't care about Danish colonialism. We don't want to defend Greenland, for Denmark. We'll defend Greenland for the Greenlanders. But in fact, the United States already has a military base in Greenland. Yeah, the big space base. They should leave that base. That should be the demand. The Canadians should say, the Canadians of all people should say, get out of Greenland, United States, get out of Greenland, Denmark. I would like to hear that as a slogan from Canada. Third contradiction is United States call for the Monroe Doctrine is going to be itself contradictory. We need to move on that. It's going to impact the governments of the right wing because Trump is going to ask for his pound of flesh from Argentina, from Chile, from all the countries of Latin America. Let that contradiction germinate. We have struggles afoot. The game is not done. Those contradictions are going to allow us to move and build mass movements, not only in Latin America, but around the world. The attempt by the United States to place its hyper-imperialism on a strong footage is not going to succeed fully. That's the third contradiction. My friends, I mean, as people involved in building people's movements around the world, working class peasant movements around the world, sometimes we are told, listen, why are you bothered about Venezuela? You should be struggling for the people of Nepal. You should be struggling for the people of Pakistan. You should be struggling for the people of Tanzania. You should be struggling for the people of Ghana. Why are you bothering yourself with Venezuela? It's far away. You know, it's not important to us. Keep talking about imperialism, not important to us. In fact, we know, and we need to do better education of our own movements and ourselves, that imperialism isn't just an empirical action. The attack on Venezuela on 3rd of January. Hyper-imperialism is a structure. It impacts all our countries. When the International Monetary Fund comes to suffocate your country, that suffocation is tantamount to the seizing of the president and taking the president off to New York City. Because in many ways, metaphorically, that's what happens to our world leaders. Our leaders get taken over by the International Monetary Fund, or the leader gets deposed and they place interim people in their place that are supposed to be the voice of the country. One way or the other, they are kidnapping leaders. It's not just Nicolas Maduro who has been kidnapped. Many of our countries have been kidnapped. When our countries surrender before the International Monetary Fund, that itself is a form of kidnapping. They are not allowing a sovereign process to go forward. If we want to create a world of sovereignty and dignity, we have to smash hyper-imperialism. We have to smash hyper-imperialism. There is no negotiation with a structure like that. It has to be totally dismantled. And it can only be dismantled by our struggles. It cannot be dismantled merely by better ideas. It needs to be dismantled by our struggles. It needs to be dismantled by our unity. And that's precisely what webinars like this demonstrate. They demonstrate our commitment to struggle, and they demonstrate our unity. There are not just Venezuelans and Latin Americans here. This event is organized by Tricontinental Asia. Asia stands with Venezuela because Asia stands against hyper-imperialism. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Vijay. For those of you in the webinar, I put in the study of hyper-imperialism, but I think with the contradictions you laid out and what has come to pass in the last 2 years, it's about time we do an update of hyper-imperialism to deepen our understanding of this concept. So we've gone quite a few questions, both in the webinar, but also online. So I've grouped them into 3 groups, but of course we have about half an hour. So if there are more questions, we can also try to take them. I'll split them into 3 blocks. One is on economy and sanctions. One of them is more on the geopolitics of oil. And the third is on information warfare. So I'll start with economy and sanctions. The first question is, what about the liberalization of the economy and the adjustments that have been made as a response to the sanctions? Is this a step backwards or a form of realism? And a related question is, do you think there's some good that can come out of this situation in the sense of potentially ending the international blockade imposed by the US? In that even maintaining the Bolivarian government without Maduro, could it help Venezuela return to a path of economic recovery and a return to international relations? Let's start with that. I'll start with Carlos, and if Vijay and Stephanie have anything to add, they can. Carlos, take it away.
Well, I mean, first, I think just the way the hybrid war has played out against Venezuela. I mean, in the last several years, not just this specific moment that we have been discussing, but in more general terms, that we have had to be creative in Venezuela in how to resist that. And I think that what what people should understand is that sometimes resistance doesn't come, or the struggle doesn't come exactly how you thought it would come in the first place, or when the conditions that you thought you would have. You're handed out certain conditions, and then you have to respond to them. And certain and the way we survived the blockade initially, we had the very first years of the blockade, especially when the oil industry was blockaded, were really harmful for Venezuelan economy. I mean, there was a if you took the income of 2014 and compared to the income of the country in 2020, you had lost about 90% of the income because of the sanctions. So we had to do other things, and perhaps adjustments to legislation, adjustment to just the practices, so that we can survive. Now, the interesting thing is that this is often taken by the ultra left and say, "Oh, you see, well, now they're giving up on some principles." Well, the struggle is complex. I mean, you need to do what you have to do in order to maintain the project, and you have to observe at the end, when you balance things out, who benefits and how the people actually benefit, and that's what's really going to tell you if the project is on the path that is set out to go. And for example, at one point there was a feeling or a thought that Venezuela had to nationalize everything. For example, there's one example, everything that had to do with oil distribution, gasoline distribution throughout the country. If Venezuela would have done that, it would have been completely blockaded, and the oil industry would have been completely paralyzed back in 2017. Not now, back in 2017. Venezuela then, played the, played a bit with how to deal with it, and took some routes with the private sector as well, and was the way that we were able to guarantee that the country continued to get income, that the country continue to function, and that we can still hold a policy, a social policy that would benefit the majority of the people. Guarantee education, guarantee healthcare, guarantee access to food. I mean, all these things were played out. So, we're going to probably, this is also the start of a new moment now, and we're also going to have to see how to adapt. And a revolutionary, I think a revolutionary principle is also how do you adapt the process so that you can continue the process. That is in the horizon, and I think it's going to be a challenge, of course. But you have to have clarity that the people that didn't allow Venezuela to become a neoliberal colony, the people that didn't allow Venezuela to starve to death, the people that didn't allow Venezuela to engage into a brutal, violent civil war, are the people still trying to resist and build and deepen this process. I mean, throughout all this time, yes, there were changes made, adaptations made in order to survive the sanctions, and at the same time, popular democracy, direct democracy was strengthened. We set up communes. We set up a form of direct territorial democracy that has been unprecedented in Latin America, and that is what has guaranteed this popular support. So we have to understand that these projects, or these revolutions in the context of hyperimperialism are complex, are difficult, and that they take their own shape in order to survive. We have to analyze at the end how the people get benefited, how the people are not handed over to exploitation and to starvation like they are when you really set up a neoliberal and imperialist path.
Thank you, Carlos. I don't know if Vijay or Stephanie, you want to jump in? If not, I'll go to another set of questions. Okay. So this one, I think, has a series of questions relating to information warfare, broadly speaking. But the first is around, how do we understand the role of the Venezuelan army? Didn't they have information that prepared them around this invasion? And then how do we understand this in the era of a global system? Is the world multipolar or still unipolar? I'm going to give a couple more. Next to that is, I'm summarizing a larger comment, is that how should we, as the international left, respond to the anti-Bolivarian revolution critiques that also come from the left, citing people like Fred Fuentes, that the Maduro government has pursued austerity, which you touched upon a little bit, weakened labor, repressed popular movements, restricted political rights, and the claims of socialism has no basis in reality. And the third is a more broad question, is that what should be the strategy, especially for students, to develop an understanding of these advancements in this time when you have contradicting left and right-wing narratives? I don't know if Vijay, you want to take that first, and then we can see.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something that I've written about a lot, which is, this idea of how do you evaluate socialism? Because really that's the question. I'm talking about the second issue about, repressing labor rights, this, that, and the other. How do you evaluate socialism? So the first thing is that every single project to build socialism has taken place in a poor country. I mean, I was quite surprised to read a former vice president of Bolivia say that the Latin American left needs to take lessons from the mayoral campaign of Zoran Mamdani. Zoran Mamdani is an extremely nice person. He's a young guy. But for God's sake, fellas, he just won a mayor's race in New York City. He hasn't even started governing barely. How would the Latin American left take lessons from that? The real victories have taken place in Asia, Chinese Revolution, Vietnamese Revolution. I mean, these are significant processes in poor countries. That's the first point. Second point is that nobody in 1945 said that Vietnam is a socialist country. It was a country governed by a bloc that was committed to socialism. It was going to take a long time to advance the productive forces, to rearrange social relations and so on. They had a theory for this, but there was no question that there were going to be lots of reversals, lots of errors, and lots of learning on the way forward. You see, the problem with what I call nitpicking leftists is that they find things and then they decide that these 6 things which they find are evidence for them to evaluate this as a failed project. It's almost a kind of NGOization of evaluation of socialism. What are the benchmarks and so on. Socialism is a very complicated process to build. It's like the debate around China. Is China socialist? It's the most dull discussion to have. Far more interesting is try to understand what has the Chinese project been able to achieve? What are they struggling with? What are the contradictions? In other words, to have a Marxist approach to evaluation of socialism and not have an NGO-esque approach. Here a person was harassed. There, a factory, the labor union was shut down. This sort of empirical attitude, which you then sort of accumulate and say, well, if you add all these together, it's no longer socialism. I would ask, how many quantity of empirical things do you need to have, merely empirical, before you make a qualitative judgment? But in fact, prior to that, what's the qualitative judgment based on? So I would say that part of this is also a failure of our national liberation Marxism. We have not properly constructed a theory of evaluating socialism. We haven't really done that. How do we evaluate socialism? How do we talk about retreats and problems and failures? How do we evaluate socialism based on the suffocation of imperialism? When Lenin had to do the new economic policy in the Soviet Union, that was in a response both to the imperialist suffocation, and it was a response to the fact that Russia was a backward economic country. In Venezuela, the process, inherited an appalling situation in 1998. Was completely food dependent. Now it is food sovereign. That is an enormous advance made under immense duress. But that is not going to be emphasized. What will be emphasized are these 20 things, which then apparently accumulate to show that it is not socialism. So I would take responsibility for it somewhat, that we haven't created a good basis for evaluation. But I would also say to our friends who are kind of nitpickers on these things that, you can go ahead and do what you're doing. But what you're doing is not helping us advance the socialist project. It's actually demoralizing, and it doesn't move us on the contradictions. It merely has you come off as somebody who's bitter and on the sidelines, not part of the process to build socialism internationally.
Thanks, Vijay, for that. And I think that's an important question that we face in many of the socialist or socialist-oriented projects consistently. I have a couple of questions here, and I want to direct them to Stephanie. And of course, Stephanie can add to any of the previous questions if she has anything. But specifically on the question of Trump and mobilization. And the first question is, how are the rallies within the US against Trump? And is there any real possibility that the large demonstrations in the US will disable the Trump administration? A second question from someone else is that if someone replaces Trump, will he or she just continue Trump's project? So I'll pass it to you, Stephanie.
First, I wanted to speak to this point that was just addressed by Vijay, and I wanted to start by saying that, comrades, this is all false information. It's as false as the claims that the Bolsheviks ate babies in the winter, as false as the claims that China has concentration camps within in Xinjiang. This is all fake information, and I think that more than anything, we need to educate our comrades to question the information that they are exposed to based on class instincts. They need to understand who is saying this and what are the interests behind this discourse. I think that when we assume that everything that is put out and everything that we're exposed to is just neutral information, it's just objective information, we forget everything that we have learned about ideology and about class struggle. Everything has a class position and has a class motivation. And so how can we say that? How can we think to ourselves that, oh, well, the US is willing to bomb indiscriminately, but not lie? They wouldn't infiltrate think tanks. They wouldn't direct the press. They wouldn't co-opt journalists. They wouldn't buy a variety of different academic institutions and professors to profess the kind of information that they want to put out there. Let's not be naive. There's a lot of false information moving around about not just Venezuela, but about China, now about the Sahel states in West Africa, about Cuba historically. And so we have to look at the US runs from one crazy narrative to the next, right? And they mobilize different narratives according to who they will work with. So with a broad audience, they mobilize the narrative that all left presidents in the region are narco traffickers. But with a left audience, they mobilize the narrative that, oh, well, Venezuela is suppressing unions, because they know that that's something that will be much more believable to union organizers, to left figures around the world. So they have different communication strategies based on who it is that they're trying to co-opt and confuse. And their ultimate goal is to demobilize us, right? Because once you get exposed to so much information as a leftist that says that Venezuela is not a left project, even if you don't fully believe it, even if that you're not sure, what it does is that it has the effect of demobilizing you. Now you're not coming out and supporting these left projects. And so I have to say that when we are quicker to question a working class project than denouncing the forces that have historically massacred them and destroyed them, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I think that it's important to remember that the same questions that you are asking will be asked of you when you take power, at a time when what you need is ideas, when what you need is solidarity and not a cross-examination. I was a union organizer for many, many years. And in the union, every time we did an organizing campaign, we would do something where we called inoculating workers, where before the workers would come out publicly, we would prepare them and say, this is what the company is going to tell you about the union to try to demobilize you. They're going to tell you that the union is a mob. They're going to tell you that the union is a corrupt institution, that it's going to take away your wages. They're going to tell you that the union is going to take away your free will and your ability to negotiate with your boss. And we would prepare them for these lies, because every single time that workers would fight, the company would come out with an aggressive campaigns to delegitimize the union. And that's what we need to be doing with our comrades right now. We need to be inoculating them. We need to be telling them, this is the playbook of US imperialism. This is the playbook of the right. These are all the things that they're going to say. And fortunately for us, they've all said these things before. None of these stories are new. The same story that the left represses social movements was mobilized during the times of the Soviet Union. It was mobilized against Cuba. It is being mobilized against China. And so we should be able to prepare our comrades and say, this is what is going to be said, and prepare them so that we're not confronting each and every single lie. We're teaching people to have class instincts and to know what side they are standing in these kinds of conflicts, in these kinds of confrontations. And there is no room, comrades, for us to stand on the wall right now. There's no room of like, well, I'm kind of not sure what I think about this. I'm neutral about this. I'm still not sure about the Venezuelan revolution. You're either on one side or the other. And if you're taking this position of I'm still questioning, I'm still gathering information, I'm still not sure if this is something that I should defend, you're on the side of US imperialism right now. So about these protests against Trump, I have to say that we have to remember that US imperialism is a system, not a president. No US president has actually been able to pursue an agenda that doesn't forward US imperialism. Not even Kennedy, not even Carter, who were supposedly the better presidents in US history. Carter was the one that gave the Shah of Iran a home in the United States and defended them against the Iranian Revolution. So let's not be naive and think, well, if Trump comes out of power and maybe new forces become elected, this project is going to be somehow halted. It's going to take major transformations inside of the United States for the project of US imperialism to be abandoned. But fortunately for us, it doesn't just depend on what happens in the United States, it depends on what happens around the world. The thing that is going to overthrow US imperialism is not elections in the United States. It's projects of transformation being victorious in other countries in the world, is new revolutions coming up. And this is why it's important to defend the existing ones. Because if we're serious about overthrowing US imperialism, we need revolutions to come up and the ones that are existing to survive. Because we need to build a broader front of opposition to US imperialism. And so it is very uplifting and very inspiring to see that the United States working class is mobilizing increasingly against the fascism and the imperialism of the Trump administration. But let's not think that it depends on them. It depends on us. We need to advance left projects within our countries. And we do that by having clear left positions, by not confusing the masses, by being hesitant about our positions when things like what's happening in Venezuela is happening. We have to remember that everybody here, we're in the leadership of organizations. And when we take a position that is hesitant, that is kind of lukewarm, we confuse the masses. We don't provide clear leadership that the people can follow. And so that is our role. If we want Trump to be defeated, if we want this project to be defeated, we need to have clarity. We need to provide clear leadership, and we need to know what side of history that we're on.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, for those words. I think I'm going to take us to maybe closing comments. I mean, there's a lot of other very interesting and relevant questions, but we won't be able to go into detail, but I'll just maybe briefly summarize some of them. And if you want to, in your closing comments, address any of it or just share your general views, feel free to do so. Basically, there are questions around, Venezuela's role in global oil and energy politics. We have questions on how to confront the tech-driven aspect of imperialism and this information warfare that all of the speakers have talked about. Questions of how we can coordinate international solidarity in a more timely and effective manner. And also what kinds of dynamics and trends are we going to see in Venezuela in the coming days? I mean, these are many broad questions, but of course, I'm going to maybe give each of our speakers in the order that you presented 2 or 3 minutes to give your closing comments, starting with Carlos.
Yeah, well, a lot of these things will take, I guess, some time to delve into, and we unfortunately don't have that much time. I think Venezuela needs, right now, the Bolivarian Revolution needs everyone's support. I think that's important. I think it's important for us to defend President Maduro and Cilia Flores and not leave them, just forget about them. I think it's important because it highlights the monstrosity of imperialism, and it's important not to forget them. So I think the first thing would be, that I would ask is to remember them, and to actively support their return back to Venezuela. Second, I think we need a comprehension of that challenging times are ahead for Venezuela, of course, but we have a solid we built a solid process, and I think it's going to show for the next the coming years or whatever it takes. But it's important that unity, that I mean the lesson of unity, um, and the lesson of trust in the revolutionary process is key. And I think international solidarity has a role to play again in helping to build that unity and not to be a chorus to this divisionism. And thirdly, again, internationalism it will always have a role in defending processes like this, in defending stability and defending peace. The more we we are united in denouncing what took place in Venezuela and in supporting the Venezuelan revolution, the more that we can protect our own processes and our own futures. We are under a hyper-imperialist age. This is a tough age. We have to see it with reality and not idealism, but also with the trust that we are capable of doing remarkable things as well.
Thanks, Carlos. Stephanie, your closing remarks?
Comrades, I think that this is a tremendously trying moment in history for our forces, but I have to say that I'm very optimistic because I think that as the contradictions are becoming clearer, as the United States is becoming much more cynical and actually honest about its intentions, I think that that puts us in a position where they're doing our job for us partially. They're helping us to basically prove what we have been saying for decades, to say that there is no global project to spread democracy, no global project to promote development. This is the United States nakedly pursuing its own self-interest, pursuing the self-interest of the United States ruling class, of the elite, not even of the US working class, which is increasingly coming out into the streets to protest. And so I think that this opens up a possibility for us, but it's our role to capture it, to take that possibility. I am incredibly inspired by the protests that I see happening all over the world. I'm inspired to see people in Bangladesh marching for Maduro. I'm inspired to see George Abdallah coming out in protest in Beirut today, defending Venezuelan sovereignty. So the resilience and the resolve of our forces to come out and to keep denouncing US imperialism, to be undeterred, is what inspires me. And so I think that this is our role right now, to lead with confidence, to lead with clear direction, to know our history and to know that our future is one of victory. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. And final words to you, Vijay.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of points. The first one is, that the subtitle of our study on hyperimperialism highlights the words dangerous and decadent. And I want to explain what these words mean so there's no misunderstanding. The dangerous part is pretty straightforward. I mean, hyperimperialism is dangerous. Trump has bombed whoever he wants. I don't really second guess. People in Beijing or Tehran or wherever, they feel that this American war machine is dangerous. It's very dangerous. What they did in Venezuela was an extraordinary act of danger for the Venezuelan people. They wiped out people. It's almost like they have alien technology. You ask, well, where was the Venezuelan military? Well, how do you, it's a little bit like 1911 when the Italians aerial bombed Libya. The Libyan fighters were fighting them with guns into the sky that were not even reaching, 10 feet above their heads, whereas they were being bombed by planes ruthlessly from the sky. I mean, no country has the technology to take out 150 US aircraft, much more intense than shock and awe in Iraq. That was 22 years ago. Okay, so one is it's dangerous, and we have to really be clear about that. Secondly, it's decadent. It doesn't have a project for us. You can't just bomb countries and expect us all to be in awe of you. What they did to Gaza is clear. It was danger. They destroyed Gaza, but they are decadent. They have no plan. All they can say is, we're going to build a Trump hotel. That's a sign of decadence. That's what we mean by decadence. They don't have a project for the world. That's the reason we reject them, and we are not afraid of their danger, because they don't have a project for us. That makes them absolutely decadent. They are a decaying political force. We have a project. What has been happening in the global south is a project for humanity, whether it's abolishing poverty in Kerala, in China, or it is trying to take control over our raw materials in Indonesia, partly, but also, of course, even in Zambia, where they just walked out of the International Monetary Fund deal for now. Let's see what happens. These are very interesting examples of trying to advance the people's project. We have a project, they don't have a project. And I have to say, I'm really happy that all of us are involved in the IPA project, the International People's Assembly project. Because to be frank with you, this is absolutely essential, vital chord of international solidarity for our movements. It has allowed us to learn more deeply about what's happening in each place. It has allowed us to cut through the information war. Without having access to our comrades in Venezuela through the IPA, we wouldn't really know the details about what was happening. We might even fall prey, and some people did, of the rumor mongering that was being spread by the imperialists about this section of the government, that section, who sold whom out. Tariq Ali was out there saying, I spoke to somebody in Caracas. That sort of lie is very dangerous. It's the IPA that actually was the vaccination against the lies. And so I'm really proud of what we have done here. And I'm also really happy that Atul and Tings organized this through the Tricontinental Asia branch, not Latin America, not Nuestra America, but Asia. Because Asia has to also articulate some of this, not just as hands of Venezuela, but hands of Asia, hands of Bangladesh, hands of Nepal. On the 16th of January will be Resistance Day in India. It will be led by the farmers, agricultural workers, and peasants. 16th of January, in less than a week. Resistance Day in India, Resistance Day in Asia, hands off Venezuela, but also hands off Asia. Get rid of all the military bases in East Asia. Why should the United States have such a large footprint in Japan, in Korea, in Philippines, all across up into Central Asia? Why should they be there? Hands off Asia.
Thank you, Vijay, Carlos, and Stephanie. I think a good segue from Vijay's comment there is that this event, of course, is organized by Tricontinental Asia. One of the things that our region, unfortunately, knows very well is this weight of empire. We have the echoes of Iraq and Libya, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea. We just celebrated the 80th anniversary of the victory in the world anti-fascist war. So we've seen when the bombs fell on Caracas and the kidnapping of Maduro and Flores, that there were people across Asia, across this region, workers who are leaving factories, students that filled the streets. We have people marching and holding actions in the U.S. embassies. Because we understand, too, that this assault on Venezuelan sovereignty is an assault on all of our countries. And here, even in this event, at least those that I'm seeing in the webinar, we have people from India to Nepal, Bangladesh, South Korea, Philippines, Pakistan, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Australia, China. We also have, comrades from Brazil, South Africa, Italy, Mexico, United States, and many organizations being represented here. And I want to maybe close off with an important call to all of us, is that our solidarity must extend beyond this moment. And as all of our speakers have shared, this is going to be a struggle for a long period in this hyper-imperialist phase. So we need to continue to mobilize, first of all. Every action that you organize makes the defense of Venezuela more visible and more credible. build the broadest unity that you can with the unions, with the student organization, peace movements, faith communities. Counter the psychological warfare, this media assault. You can learn and share the analysis, whether it's through the IPA and its calls for coordinated actions, of course, through the Tricontinental and our many publications, and also inform yourself from news partners such as People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. And finally, I would say that we have to remember the stakes. For the past 25 years, the Bolivarian Revolution has shown us that another world is possible and one that is striving to build socialism. And its defeat would be a historic setback for progressive forces around the world. And of course, we know that revolutions are not just based on individuals, they are the part of the collective process that's rooted in millions. So Maduro right now might be held in New York, but the Bolivarian Revolution lives on in the Venezuela's communes, the militias, in the streets, but also in our international solidarity. And so I'm going to close off with the great revolutionary poet from Pakistan, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who also knew prison and resistance very well. And he said that, speak, your lips are free. Speak, it is your own tongue. Speak, it is your own body. Speak, your life is still yours. Speak this brief hours long enough before the death of body and tongue. Speak, because the truth is not yet dead. Speak, speak, whatever you must speak. So let us speak. Let us say free Maduro and Celia Flores. Let us defend the Venezuelan Bolivarian Revolution, and also long live international solidarity. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us today, and let us continue in the struggle together. If people would like to turn on their cameras or say a greeting of goodbye, we welcome you all. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Venceremos.
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 So
Thank you,
much.
everybody.
Bye.
All the best. Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
Tujang.
Tujang. Tujang.
Thank you. Venceremos.
Thank you.
Tujang. My God, that was like a what's it called, a reflex. Tujang. Guys, Tujang is the Korean for struggle. Yeah?
Yeah, correct.
Tujang.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Oh, it's
Thank
so
you,
nice to see
Venceremos.
people. Yeah,
Recording
venceremos.
stopped.
Chalo, well played, Atul.
Very
Well
good.
played, Tings.
Everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Amilcar.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Exactly.
Thank you,
Amilcar.
Amilcar.
Thanks, Amilcar. और किसको thanks करना है?
Ambi, Shiran, everyone. I mean, everyone
कहाँ
present here.
है?
Thank you so much.
Ambi छुपा रुस्तम. Ambi is disappeared.
And poor Amilcar always has to wake up in